Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the moment one hospital visit changes everything when Jack and Tu Tien hear the doctor say, "It's a girl." And suddenly, every fear, every hope, and every dream about the future becomes real. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The hospital corridor glowed with a cold white light that made everything feel cleaner, quieter, and somehow more fragile. Tu Tien sat on the waiting bench with both hands resting lightly over the round curve of her belly, her fingers trembling every now and then in a way she could not fully control. The glass doors reflected pale streaks of fluorescent light across the polished floor, and somewhere farther down the hall, nurses' shoes clicked in steady rhythms that made the silence feel even larger. Jack sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body even in that chilly place. His hand covered hers completely, big and steady, not gripping too tightly, just enough to say what words could not. "I'm here. I'm not moving. Whatever happens next, you won't face it alone." Tu Tien kept her eyes forward at first, trying to focus on the wall across from them, on the framed posters about prenatal care, on anything that would stop her mind from racing ahead. But her thoughts kept circling back to the same thing: the baby, the appointment, the sound she hoped to hear, the fear she didn't want to admit out loud. There was joy inside her, yes, but it lived beside fear now. Ever since pregnancy had become real, love and worry had stopped arriving separately. From the next room came the faint rhythmic beat of a fetal heartbeat monitor, soft and distant but unmistakable. The sound moved through the corridor like a promise made of static and pulse. Tu Tien's breathing changed when she heard it. Jack noticed immediately. He turned toward her, his expression tightening with concern and tenderness all at once. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though the movement was small. "Just nervous." Jack's thumb moved across the back of her hand in a slow stroke. "Me too." That made her smile. Fragile, but real. The truth was written all over him if you knew how to read him. Jack was trying to stay calm for her, trying to be the steady one, the practical one, the one who could absorb the weight of the moment without letting it spill over. But his eyes kept giving him away. There was too much in them: anxiety, hope, the fierce protectiveness of a man who had already begun to love someone he had not yet met. Tu Tien turned toward him and studied his face for a moment. In the hard hospital light, he looked more tired than usual, more exposed. She lifted their joined hands slightly and gave his fingers a small squeeze. "We're okay," she whispered. It sounded like she was reassuring him, but she was really trying to reassure both of them. Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was almost lost in the hum of the corridor. "No matter what," he said, "I'm right here." The words settled into her more deeply than she expected. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. That had always been the most dangerous and beautiful thing about Jack. He never said more than he meant, but what he meant reached all the way to the bone. A nurse stepped out from behind the reception desk and called Tu Tien's name. Everything changed at once. Tu Tien drew in a careful breath and stood slowly. Jack rose with her immediately, one arm hovering protectively near her back without crowding her. They walked side by side toward the examination room, each step quiet but heavy with feeling. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Their silence had become its own language. The examination room was warmer than the corridor, lit with a softer white that made the machine seem less harsh. The ultrasound monitor sat dark for a moment, and then the doctor switched it on, filling the room with a low electronic hum. Tu Tien lay back on the bed and lifted her gown enough to reveal her belly. The gel was cold when the doctor spread it across her skin, and she flinched slightly. Jack moved closer at once. He stood beside the bed and took her hand again, his fingers threading through hers, with the kind of care that made everything else in the room fall away. The doctor moved the probe slowly across Tu Tien's belly. At first, the screen showed only blurred shadows and grainy shapes. Then the image shifted, adjusted, clarified, and suddenly there she was. Tiny, curled, distinct in a way that made both of them forget how to breathe. A small face, a little arm, one tiny hand lifting in the flickering monochrome image as if she were already reaching toward them. Jack's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. Tu Tien stared so hard her eyes filled before she even understood why. The room seemed to narrow until it held only the screen, the machine, the pulse of that moment. The doctor's voice came calmly, professionally, but the words landed like thunder in both their chests. "The baby is developing well," she said. "Strong heartbeat." She adjusted the angle once more, checked the image, then smiled. "It's a girl." A girl. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then Tu Tien broke first. Tears spilled down her cheeks in a rush so sudden she didn't even try to stop them. Jack bent over her immediately, pressing his forehead against hers, his own breath unsteady now, his smile trembling with something too large to hide. "A girl," he said hoarsely. "Our daughter." Tu Tien gave a broken little laugh through her tears. "I knew," she whispered. "I could feel it." The doctor smiled again, gentler this time, giving them a few seconds before finishing the measurements. Jack never let go of Tu Tien's hand. If anything, his grip grew firmer, as though the joy itself had made him need something real to hold on to. When the ultrasound image printed, the doctor handed over the small, glossy photo, and Jack accepted it with both hands. The paper looked so slight, so ordinary, and yet it held an entire future inside it. He stared down at the blurred curve of their baby girl and traced the image lightly with one fingertip, almost afraid touching it too hard might disturb the miracle of it. Tu Tien turned her head toward him. He was smiling, but tears had gathered in his eyes too, making the edges of that smile tremble. "She's really here," he said softly. Tu Tien nodded. "She's really here." The doctor gave them instructions, pointed out the heartbeat again, and spoke about development in practical terms that neither of them fully absorbed because their hearts had already run ahead of language. Strong heartbeat, healthy growth, a girl. The words became anchors in the room, and each one felt like a new beam of light, pushing back all the quiet fears they had carried in with them. When the appointment was over, Jack helped Tu Tien sit up, then handed her the tissue box before she even asked. She laughed at that through her tears. "You knew. I know you." That answer nearly undid her all over again. He waited while she cleaned the gel from her belly, then reached for her cardigan and helped her into it with absurd care, as if she might break from happiness instead of weakness. Once she was fully dressed, he slid his arm around her shoulders and drew her close enough that she could lean into him without thinking. They stepped back into the corridor together. It looked the same as before, the same pale light, the same distant footsteps, the same polished floor, but everything inside them had changed. The waiting bench was empty now, the air no longer heavy with uncertainty, but still carrying the aftertaste of tension that had just broken open into joy. They walked slowly, not because Tu Tien couldn't walk faster, but because neither of them was ready for the moment to end. Jack kept one hand on the ultrasound photo and the other around her shoulders. Every few steps, his arm tightened slightly, as if he needed to remind himself that both she and their daughter were still within reach. Outside, late afternoon had already begun to soften the day. By the time they reached the car, sunlight was spilling low and gold through the trees. Jack opened the passenger door for her, helped her in, then stood there for a second longer than necessary with one hand resting on the roof of the car. Tu Tien looked up at him through the open door. "What?" she asked, smiling now, calmer, lighter, though tears still clung to her lashes. Jack shook his head once and let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. He looked down at the ultrasound photo in his hand, then back at her. "I can't stop thinking it." "Thinking what?" He leaned closer, voice softening into something almost reverent. "That we're going home with a daughter." The drive home felt completely different from every drive they had taken before. The road was the same, of course, the same turns, the same familiar trees, the same stretch of afternoon light falling across the windshield, but inside the car, everything had shifted. Tu Tien sat in the passenger seat with the ultrasound photo resting carefully in both hands, as if it were something alive and delicate. She kept looking down at it, then out the window, then back at it again, unable to decide which felt more real. the quiet world passing by outside, or the tiny girl who now existed in a small black and white image on glossy paper. Jack drove more slowly than usual. One hand stayed steady on the wheel, while the other kept drifting toward her, touching the back of her hand, brushing her sleeve, resting briefly on her knee as if he needed to keep proving to himself that she was here, safe, beside him. He had not fully come down from the moment in the examination room. Part of him was still standing there, hearing the doctor say it again. It's a girl, their girl. Tu Tien turned the photo slightly so the light hit it better. A smile stayed on her mouth, soft and almost disbelieving. Her eyes, though, had gone distant in the way they did when a feeling was too large to fit into words right away. Jack glanced at her, then back at the road. You're very quiet. She looked at him and gave a tiny laugh. I think if I talk too much, I'll cry again. That makes two of us. That earned him a fuller smile. For a few minutes, they let the silence hold them. The car moved through the familiar countryside, past trees that threw long shadows across the road, past little houses with smoke lifting from kitchens, past fields that looked washed in pale gold. Everything outside seemed to welcome them without knowing why. Finally, Jack switched on the radio, then changed his mind and turned it lower until the music was barely more than a thread. Soft piano notes drifted into the car and settled between them. Who do you think she'll be like? He asked after a while. The question was so gentle it almost made Tu Tien cry anyway. She turned toward him, one hand moving instinctively to her belly. I hope she's like you, she said. Jack gave her a quick sideways look, surprised. Me? Strong, she said, and gentle. You don't know how rare that is. His throat tightened around whatever answer he might have made. He looked back at the road and smiled instead, because sometimes the only way to survive happiness is to let it settle slowly. A little later, Tu Tien felt something small, quick, unmistakable. Her hand pressed more firmly against her belly. Jack noticed at once. What? She kicked. He reached over immediately, not quite sure where to put his hand, then rested it over hers. For one suspended second, neither of them breathed. Then it came again. A faint, soft movement under the warmth of their joined hands. Jack made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. She heard us, Tu Tien whispered. No, he said, smiling through eyes that had suddenly gone bright. She's already interrupting us. Tu Tien laughed, and this time the tears came too, but they were not heavy tears. They were light enough to survive happiness. Jack pulled his hand back just long enough to wipe them from her cheek with his thumb. When the supermarket came into view, he slowed and turned into the parking area without asking. Tu Tien looked at him. What are we doing? He switched off the engine and turned to her fully. We're starting. She glanced down at the ultrasound picture, then back at him. Starting what? Her life with us. There was no grand speech in it, no performance, just simple certainty. And that was exactly why it moved her. Jack got out first, came around the car, and opened her door. He offered his hand to help her step down, and he did it with such unnecessary care that she smiled before she even touched the pavement. Inside, the store was bright with fluorescent light and crowded with the soft colors of baby things. Pastel pinks, pale blues, creams, yellow ducks, tiny socks, blankets, folded like clouds. The air smelled faintly of powder, clean fabric, and plastic packaging. The cartwheels clicked softly over the polished floor as Jack pushed it forward, more serious than anyone had a right to be while looking at baby shelves. Tu Tien walked beside him, one hand occasionally touching the edge of the cart, the other still holding the ultrasound photo folded safely inside her bag. She stopped first at the clothing section and lifted a tiny pink bodysuit with little flowers printed near the collar. This one is adorable, she said quietly. Jack looked at it with the solemn expression of a man considering a major investment. Then we take it, she laughed. You don't even know if she'll fit in it. I know she'll be adorable. They moved slowly down the aisle, dropping small things into the cart. Newborn diapers, tiny socks, soft burp cloths, a set of baby bottles, washcloths, a blanket with a faint rabbit pattern stitched into the edge. Jack stood too long in front of the diapers, turning one pack over, then another. What if she grows fast? He asked. We buy more later. What if these are too small? Then we buy bigger ones. What if Tu Tien laid her hand over his? Alex. He looked at her. We don't have to build her whole life tonight. That stopped him. He let out a short breath and nodded once. Right. They moved on. At the toy section, Jack picked up a small plush bear and squeezed it once, testing the softness with absurd seriousness before placing it into the cart like it was a ceremonial offering. Tu Tien watched him with a feeling so full it almost hurt. The strong, composed man everyone else knew was standing under bright store lights, worrying about diaper sizes and plush bears, learning tenderness in public without shame. It made her love him with an intensity that felt almost frightening. At the checkout counter, Jack lifted the bags himself, even when the cashier offered to help arrange them in the cart. By the time they stepped back outside, twilight had deepened, and the sky was moving from gold into blue. The house greeted them with warm lamplight and stillness. Jack carried the bags in first and set them down in the living room, then immediately rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He spread a soft cream rug near the sofa. He checked the temporary bassinet twice before deciding where it should sit. He lined up bottles, inspected the seals, stacked diapers with ridiculous care, folded tiny clothes, then unfolded them just to smooth the fabric again. Tu Tien sat on the couch watching him, one hand moving slowly over her belly in small circles. She didn't try to stop him at first. There was too much love in what he was doing. Every movement of his carried the same message. I am making room for her. I am making room for both of you. I am ready. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with affection. Take it slow. Don't tire yourself. Jack glanced over and smiled. I want everything ready before she gets here. She doesn't need all this yet. I do. That answer silenced her in the best way. A few minutes later, he noticed tears on her face and crossed the room instantly. Why are you crying? Tu Tien laughed through it, embarrassed and overwhelmed at once. Because you're too good. Jack knelt in front of her and wiped the tears away with his thumbs. That seems like a bad reason. She shook her head. It's exactly the reason. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then rested there for a second. Both of them breathing in the warm quiet of the house, surrounded by tiny clothes and small practical promises. Later, while the scent of chicken broth, lotus seeds, ginger, and steamed fish began to fill the kitchen, Jack cooked and Tu Tien stood in the doorway, watching him, one hand resting against the frame. He turned and told her to go sit down because the kitchen was warm. She ignored him and came closer anyway, wrapping her arms around him carefully from behind. I want to stay here, she said. Jack smiled and covered her hands with his. Just a few more months, he murmured, and this house is going to sound completely different. Tu Tien pressed her cheek lightly between his shoulder blades. I can't wait. By the time they sat down to eat, candlelight from the table softened everything even more. Jack placed the tenderest piece of fish into her bowl. She smiled at him, eyes still shining with all the things she could not say properly. Between bites, they started talking about names. If it's a girl, Tu Tien said, what about Min Shou? Jack repeated it quietly. Min Shou. He smiled, bright and precious. She nodded. Our daughter, he said. The words changed the room all over again. After dinner, they cleared the dishes together, dimmed the lights, and settled onto the sofa. Jack drew her close against his chest and rested one hand over her belly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the quiet house, to each other's breathing, to the strange, beautiful feeling of a future arriving one tender moment at a time. At the hospital, Tu Tien and Jack sit side by side in a cold, bright corridor, holding hands and carrying equal parts fear and hope. Inside the examination room, the ultrasound reveals the miracle they have been waiting for, a healthy baby girl. The doctor's calm words, strong heartbeat, it's a girl, break open an overwhelming wave of relief, tears, and joy. On the drive home, they begin imagining their daughter's future, wondering whose eyes and smile she will inherit. Instead of rushing back to ordinary life, they stop at the supermarket and carefully choose baby clothes, diapers, bottles, and a small plush toy. each item feeling like a promise. Back at home, Jack turns their little house into a nest of love, organizing everything for their baby while cooking nourishing food for Tu Tien. That night, wrapped in soft lamplight, they begin preparing their hearts for parenthood.